but it was the kind of place you could imagine living in for a while, in a slow-moving river. The Chaudière-Appalaches region is a tapestry of pastoral beauty, with rolling hills, sprawling. Farmers worked in the distance, their tractors moving slowly through the fields, gathering what they'd been witness to 1,000 stories over centuries of time. Insignificant. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, moment from the past. And now, sitting here in Sherbrooke, I felt strangely whole, as if the drive had stitched together the scattered pieces of my life. Freedom in driving at night, a kind of quiet solitude that I hadn't realized I needed. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was a blanket of constellations, each one sharp and clear against the inky black. That's kind of what I'm looking for. The man didn't say anything else, just handed me my change and turned his attention back to the small TV behind the counter, where at the same time, the road was all that existed, and I was just... This stretch of the journey felt different, quieter, perhaps, but also more vivid. The air was cool now, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves, the kind that The morning light filtered through the trees, casting golden patches on the road. The Chaudière River, just visible from the highway, shimmered like silver thread in the distance. As I drove through the quiet streets of St. George, a sense of calm hung over the town. It was still early, too early for most to be out and about. The air had that clean, crisp bite that comes with late summer mornings in Quebec, the kind of air that made you feel wide awake, even if your mind was still half asleep. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the town as it disappeared behind me. St. George had never been home, but it was the kind of place you could imagine living in for a while, a brief chapter in the novel of your life. Small enough to feel intimate but big enough to avoid the claustrophobia of small-town life. But I was ready to leave. There was a pull in the road ahead, a familiar yearning to keep moving. The journey ahead stretched about 150 kilometers northeast, toward Sherbrooke, a city I'd been to only once before, years ago. The reasons for this trip were vague even to me. Perhaps it was the need for motion, for a change of scenery, or maybe it was something deeper, something about finding myself in the spaces between destinations. The highway opened up, and the dense forest lining the road became a blur of green. I settled into the rhythm of the drive, the low hum of the engine and the tires skimming the asphalt. As I left the outskirts of St. George behind, my mind began to wander, memories floating to the surface like driftwood in a slow-moving river. The Chaudière-Appalaches region is a tapestry of pastoral beauty, with rolling hills, sprawling farmlands, and small villages that dot the landscape like forgotten time capsules. As I wound my way through the countryside, the landscape opened up, offering glimpses of a world that felt unhurried, as though time moved slower here. I passed a sign for the village of Beauceville. A part of me was tempted to pull off the road, to explore the quiet streets, but I stayed on course. There would be time for detours later, I told myself. For now, the road was enough. The fields on either side of me were filled with the last blooms of summer, goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace swayed in the wind, and I could smell the earthy sweetness of hay in the air. Farmers worked in the distance, their tractors moving slowly through the fields, gathering what the land had given them this season. I thought of my father then, of the summers we spent working on my uncle's farm when I was a kid. It had been backbreaking work, but it had grounded me, given me a sense of connection to the land that I hadn't fully appreciated at the time. As the road curved and dipped, I noticed a distant mountain range rising up like a dark wall against the horizon. The Appalachians. They were smaller here than the dramatic peaks of the Rockies, but there was something about their worn, ancient shapes that made them feel even more powerful, as if they'd been witness to 1,000 stories over centuries of time. By the time I reached Thetford Mines, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light over the town's industrial landscape. Thetford Mines had once been known for its asbestos industry, a strange, almost forgotten legacy that still lingered in the bones of the town. I pulled off the highway and into a gas station, needing to stretch my legs and clear my head after the long drive through the hills. The gas station was like any other, a utilitarian outpost in the middle of nowhere, its pumps worn from years of service. I filled up the tank, watching the numbers on the dial rise as I stared absently at the horizon. The hills beyond the town were scarred, remnants of mining that had once been the town's lifeblood. Now they stood like silent sentinels, a reminder of the boom days long gone. Inside the station, I grabbed a coffee, nodding at the woman behind the counter as I paid. She barely glanced up from her newspaper. This town, like so many others in the region, felt frozen in time, its people moving through their routines as though nothing had changed. But I knew better, time changes everything, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Back in the car, I sipped the bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through my hands as I thought about the road ahead. Sherbrooke was still a couple of hours away, but I wasn't in a rush. The drive itself was the point, I reminded myself. The destination was secondary. As I left Thetford Mines behind, the landscape shifted. The road climbed higher into the Appalachians, and the air grew cooler, cleaner. The forests here were thick and ancient, a mix of hardwoods and evergreens that seemed to crowd the road, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The trees stood tall and proud, their roots sinking deep into the soil, as if they had been here long before any road had been carved through the wilderness. The car's engine strained a little as the road steepened, and I had to slow down as the sharp curves forced me to focus. I didn't mind. There was something meditative about driving through the mountains, the way the road twisted and turned, the landscape revealing itself in small, fleeting glimpses. I passed a lookout point, a wooden platform perched precariously on the edge of a cliff, offering a panoramic view of the valley below. I pulled over and stepped out of the car, the cool mountain air hitting my face as I walked toward the edge. The valley stretched out before me, a patchwork of forests and lakes, with the mountains rising like guardians on all sides. Standing there, I felt a strange sense of peace. The worries that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind faded away, replaced by a quiet stillness. The mountains had that effect. Their sheer size, their permanence, made my problem seem small, insignificant. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and then, slowly, I exhaled. It felt like a release, as if I was letting go of something I hadn't even realized I was holding onto. The city of Sherbrooke appeared gradually, its skyline rising from the valley like a distant promise. The transition from the quiet of the mountains to the bustle of city life was almost jarring. The streets were busier than I remembered, filled with people going about their lives, cars honking impatiently, and the constant hum of urban life filling the air. I pulled into a cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place I remembered from my last visit years ago. It was still the same, small, unassuming, with mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting out through the open door. I ordered a latte and found a seat by the window, watching the world outside. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the drive. It had been a journey through more than just physical space, it had been a journey through memory, through time. Every stretch of road had brought back something, a memory, a feeling, a moment from the past. And now, sitting here in Sherbrooke, I felt strangely whole, as if the drive had stitched together the scattered pieces of my life. The road ahead was uncertain, as it always was. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't worried about what was coming next. For now, the drive had been enough. The warmth of the cafe and the comfort of the worn leather chair began to fade as I drained the last of my coffee. Sherbrooke felt familiar, but not in the way that places you know intimately do, more like an old song you haven't heard in years but can still hum along to. It was an in-between place for me, a city I passed through rather than stayed in. I stood, tossed a few coins onto the table for the tip, and headed out the door. The air outside had a bite to it now. It wasn't quite fall, but the early signs were there, the faintest chill in the breeze, a few leaves turning from green to gold. The rhythm of the city was louder, more urgent, with people bustling by, each in their own world. For a moment, I felt like an outsider, just a traveler passing through, invisible to the flow of daily life. I wasn't sure where to go next. The city sprawled before me, its streets inviting exploration, but I wasn't ready to dive into its pulse just yet. I got back into the car, rolling down the windows to let the city air flow through. I decided to drive aimlessly for a while, to see where the road would take me within the limits of Sherbrooke. The streets here were a mix of the old and the new. Victorian houses, their bricks darkened by time, sat alongside modern apartments, sleek and glassy, reaching for the sky. I found myself driving through a neighborhood I hadn't planned on visiting. The houses were smaller here, closer together, and there was a quietness that was different from the downtown core. It felt like a place where people knew their neighbors, where children played in the front yards, and life moved at a slower pace. As I drove, memories of the last time I had been here began to surface. I had come with a friend, or maybe more than a friend, and we had wandered through these same streets, laughing at some inside joke I could no longer remember. That trip had been filled with possibility, with the kind of youthful excitement that only comes when you're exploring a new place with someone who makes the world feel brighter. But things had changed since then. We had changed. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, of turning shared paths into diverging roads. I hadn't spoken to her in years now, but as I drove past places we had walked together, I felt the echo of her presence, like a shadow that refused to fade. I pulled into a small park, one I vaguely recognized from that trip. The trees here were taller, older, and the grass was a little overgrown, as if the city had forgotten to tend to it. I parked the car and got out, taking a deep breath of the cool air. The park was empty except for a couple sitting on a bench in the distance, lost in conversation. Walking along the path, I let my thoughts drift back to that time, to the way things had been. It wasn't regret that I felt, not exactly. More like a soft melancholy, a bittersweet recognition that life moves forward whether we're ready or not, and that some things, no matter how much we want to hold on to them, slip away like sand through our fingers. I found a bench beneath a large maple tree and sat down. The wind rustled the leaves above me, the first few falling gently to the ground. I watched as they swirled in the breeze, caught in a brief dance before settling into stillness. It reminded me of how fleeting moments can be, how quickly they pass and how easily we forget them until something, a place, a sound, a scent, brings them rushing back. For a while, I sat there, letting the memories come and go, not trying to hold on to them, just letting them wash over me. The past was a strange thing. Sometimes it felt so distant, as if it belonged to someone else, and other times it was as close as a whisper, pulling you back into moments you thought you'd left behind. The sound of a car door slamming brought me back to the present. The couple on the bench was leaving, their voices carrying softly through the park as they walked to their car. I watched them go, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe it was just the awareness of how much time had passed since that first trip here. I stood up and made my way back to the car. It was getting late, and the sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the park. The drive back to the city's center was quiet, the streets less crowded now as people retreated to their homes for the evening. I found myself back in the heart of Sherbrooke, where the lights of the buildings began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating the streets in a soft, welcoming glow. As I drove past the familiar sights of the city, I realized something. This trip wasn't just about moving through physical space. It was about navigating the spaces within myself, the memories I had buried, the emotions I had left unresolved. Sherbrooke was a city, yes, but it was also a mirror, reflecting back to me the parts of my life I had been too busy to notice. I drove past the cafe again, where a few hours earlier, I had sat watching the world go by. It looked different now, bathed in the warm light of evening, but the feeling of being a traveler, of being in motion, hadn't left me. In fact, it had grown stronger. There was something about this drive, about this city, that was waking up parts of me that had been asleep for too long. I decided not to stop this time. Instead, I let the car carry me forward, past the familiar streets and into the unknown. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in a long while, that didn't matter. What mattered was the journey itself, the road beneath me, the open sky above, and the feeling that, no matter what lay ahead, I was ready to face it. As the lights of Sherbrooke faded in the rearview mirror, I knew I wasn't done traveling yet. There were more roads to explore, more places to go, more memories to uncover. And for now, that was enough. last light of day was barely a trace on the horizon when I left Sherbrooke behind. The sky, once streaked with oranges and pinks, had faded into a deep, velvety blue, and the first stars began to blink into view. The road ahead was long and empty, and though I hadn't planned on continuing to drive so late, there was something about the open highway that pulled me forward. It was as if the night itself was calling, inviting me to keep going, to see what lay beyond the next curve, the next rise in the road. There was a freedom in driving at night, a kind of quiet solitude that I hadn't realized I needed. The world outside the car felt different under the cover of darkness. The familiar became mysterious, and the unknown seemed even more alluring. I turned on the headlights, their beams cutting through the growing darkness as I made my way out of the city and back into the countryside. The first few kilometers were silent, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. As I drove, I found my mind drifting again, not toward the past this time, but toward the present, toward the road beneath my tires and the expanse of sky above me. There was something meditative about night driving. The world felt smaller, more contained, with only the narrow strip of road in front of me illuminated, the rest hidden in shadow. It was just me and the car, moving steadily through the dark. The landscape outside was still familiar in a vague way, but it had lost its sharpness. The fields, the mountains, the forests, they were all just shapes now, indistinct silhouettes that passed by like ghosts in the night. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I found myself lost in its rhythm, the gentle sway of the car as it followed the curves and dips of the highway. I hadn't planned on where to stop next. In fact, I hadn't planned much at all since leaving Sherbrooke. I had expected to stay there, maybe find a hotel and spend the night, but something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was the memories the city had stirred up, or maybe it was just the need to keep moving, to not stay in one place for too long. Whatever it was, I wasn't ready to stop yet. Not here, not now. A small town appeared up ahead, its lights flickering faintly in the distance like a beacon. I slowed as I approached, glancing at the road signs to see where I had ended up. The town's name was unfamiliar, one of the many small, forgotten places that dotted this part of Quebec. I could see a few houses, their windows dark, and a gas station with a single light above the pump. It was the kind of town that seemed to exist outside of time, where nothing much happened, and the days drifted by unnoticed. I pulled into the gas station, though I didn't really need to. It was more out of habit than necessity, a brief pause to stretch my legs and take in the quiet of the night. I got out of the car and leaned against the hood, looking up at the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was a blanket of constellations, each one sharp and clear against the inky black. I stood there for a while, just breathing in the cool night air, feeling the weight of the day's journey settle into my bones. The gas station was deserted, except for the faint glow of a small convenience store attached to it. I wandered over, not expecting much, just a bottle of water or a snack to keep me going. Inside, the place was as quiet as the night outside. The shelves were sparsely stocked, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. A tired-looking man stood behind the counter, his eyes barely lifting as I entered. He seemed used to the silence, as though he'd been standing there for hours without a soul passing through. I grabbed a bottle of water and made my way to the counter. As I paid, the man glanced up at me, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "You headed north?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. I nodded. "Just passing through." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Not much out there this time of night," he said. "Just the road and the dark." I smiled at that. "That's kind of what I'm looking for." The man didn't say anything else, just handed me my change and turned his attention back to the small TV behind the counter, where an old black and white movie flickered on the screen. I left the store and walked back to the car, the man's words lingering in my mind. Just the road and the dark. He wasn't wrong. There wasn't much out here, but somehow, that was exactly what I wanted. I got back in the car and pulled out of the gas station, the headlights cutting through the darkness once again. The town quickly faded into the rearview mirror, and soon it was just me and the open road, the black ribbon of asphalt stretching out ahead. As I drove deeper into the night, something began to shift inside me. The quiet of the road, the vastness of the sky, the endless stretch of stars above, it all felt like a kind of freedom I hadn't known I was craving. It wasn't just about the destination anymore, it was about the space between, the places that existed only in the moments you passed through them. The road wasn't just a means to an end, it was a world unto itself, a place where time slowed down and you could lose yourself in the simple act of moving forward. The further I drove, the more the landscape around me seemed to disappear, swallowed by the night. The mountains were gone now, replaced by the flat, open plains of central Quebec. The trees became sparser, their shapes barely visible against the dark sky. Every once in a while, I'd pass a farmhouse or a barn, their outlines barely discernible in the faint moonlight. At some point, I lost track of how long I'd been driving. The hours blended together, the miles ticking by unnoticed. It was as if I had entered some kind of liminal space, where the world outside was both real and unreal at the same time. The road was all that existed, and I was just a traveler passing through, carried along by its unbroken path. Eventually, the headlights caught something on the side of the road, a small sign, barely visible in the darkness. I slowed down, squinting to make out the words. It was a sign for a lake, one I didn't recognize. Without thinking, I turned off the highway and onto the narrow gravel road that led toward the water. The road wound through the trees for a few kilometers before opening up to a small clearing. I parked the car and got out, the sound of the gravel crunching beneath my feet loud in the stillness of the night. The lake was just ahead, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the stars like a mirror. I walked down to the shore, the air cool and damp with the scent of pine and earth. Standing there, at the edge of the water, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road had brought me here, to this quiet, forgotten place, far from the cities and the noise and the endless demands of life. It was just me and the lake, the stars above, and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. I sat down on a rock by the water's edge, staring out at the vast expanse of sky and the world beyond. The journey wasn't over yet. There were more roads to travel, more places to see. But for now, in this moment, I was exactly where I needed to be. The first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon with shades of lavender and pale gold. I hadn't planned on staying at the lake all night, but somewhere between the stillness of the water and the vastness of the stars, time had slipped away. I had dozed off, lulled by the rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore and the peacefulness of the night. As I stirred awake, the cool morning air prickling my skin, I realized the sky was lightening, the darkness retreating into memory. The world was waking up around me. Birds chirped softly from the trees, and a mist hung low over the lake, shimmering as the sunlight began to filter through it. I stood up, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and took in the quiet beauty of the scene. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the pinks and purples of the dawn sky. There was no sign of anyone else around, no footprints in the dirt, no distant sound of a car engine. It was as if this place existed solely for me in that moment, a secret hidden away from the rest of the world. I walked along the shore for a while, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots, feeling a strange sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a long time. There was something about being here, about this unexpected stop along my journey, that felt like a pause, a chance to catch my breath and reflect. It wasn't just the beauty of the lake or the serenity of the morning, it was the realization that, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't in a hurry. There was no rush to get anywhere, no deadlines or appointments pressing down on me. The road was still out there, waiting, but it wasn't pulling me forward with the same urgency it had before. I was free to linger, to take my time, to be in the moment. Eventually, I made my way back to the car, the warmth of the rising sun starting to burn away the morning chill. As I got behind the wheel and started the engine, I felt lighter somehow, as though the weight of the past few days had lifted, leaving me with a sense of quiet purpose. The road ahead still stretched out endlessly, but now it felt less like a journey towards something and more like a journey within. I pulled back onto the gravel road, driving slowly until I reached the highway again. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the fields as I rejoined the main road. The world had started to come alive, a few cars passed by, and I caught glimpses of farmhouses tucked into the hills, smoke rising from their chimneys. The quiet isolation of the night was gone, replaced by the soft hum of morning activity. As I drove, I found my thoughts wandering back to Sherbrooke, to the people I'd met and the places I'd passed. The city had been both a stop and a beginning, a place where the road had changed direction, though I hadn't realized it at the time. Now, with the miles behind me and the open road in front of me, I could see it more clearly. This trip wasn't just about the physical journey, but about the changes that were happening inside me, too. I hadn't set out looking for answers, but somewhere between the winding roads and the quiet moments, I had found clarity. Life wasn't about destinations, I realized, but about the spaces in between, the unexpected detours, the pauses to admire the view, the moments of reflection that come when you least expect them. The highway led me through a series of small towns, each one a blur of gas stations and corner stores, their streets quiet in the early morning. I didn't stop. Not yet. I wanted to see where the road would take me, to let the car carry me further, deeper into the heart of Quebec. The landscape began to shift again, the rolling hills giving way to denser forests, the trees standing tall and proud on either side of the road, their leaves just beginning to change color. The sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the branches, and I rolled down the windows, letting the crisp autumn air flow through the car. There was a freshness to the air, a promise of change. It was the kind of day that made you feel alive, the kind of day that reminded you of the beauty in simple things, the curve of a road, the rustling of leaves, the warmth of the sun on your face. At some point, I found myself on a smaller road, winding through a valley surrounded by mountains. The forest closed in on either side, the trees towering above me like sentinels. It felt like I had entered another world, one untouched by the bustle of modern life. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars, but there was no one else around. It was just me and the road, the mountains rising up around me, their peaks lost in the clouds. I drove slowly, savoring the feeling of being alone in this vast, untouched landscape. The road curved and dipped, following the contours of the land, and every now and then, I caught glimpses of a river running parallel to the road, its water sparkling in the sunlight. It was the kind of road that invited exploration, that made you want to take your time and see where it would lead. Eventually, I came to a small bridge, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of the car as I crossed it. On the other side, the road opened up into a clearing, and there, nestled against the mountains, was a small cabin. It looked old, its wood weathered and worn by years of wind and rain, but there was something welcoming about it, something that called to me. I pulled the car to a stop and got out, standing for a moment to take in the scene. The cabin sat at the edge of a small meadow, surrounded by tall pines, their needles swaying gently in the breeze. A narrow path led from the cabin down to the river, where the water rushed over smooth stones, its sound a constant, soothing presence. I wasn't sure who the cabin belonged to, or if anyone even lived there anymore. But as I stood there, breathing in the cool mountain air and listening to the river's song, I felt a sense of belonging, as though this place had been waiting for me all along. It wasn't on any map, and it wasn't part of my plan, but it felt right. I walked down to the river, the path soft beneath my feet, and sat on a large, flat rock by the water's edge. The sun was high in the sky now, its light reflecting off the surface of the river, making it sparkle like 1,000 diamonds. I dipped my fingers into the water, surprised by how cold it was, and watched as the current carried leaves and twigs downstream. For a long time, I sat there, just listening to the water and the wind in the trees, feeling the peace of the moment settle into me. This was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the world outside felt distant and unimportant. It was just me, the river, and the mountains, nothing else mattered. As the afternoon wore on, I knew I would have to leave eventually. The road was still out there, waiting, and there were still more miles to travel, more places to see. But for now, I was content to stay here a little longer, to let the world fade away and simply be. This trip had started as a drive, a way to clear my head and get away from it all. But it had become something more, a journey of discovery, not just of the places I passed, but of myself. The road had shown me things I hadn't expected, and in the quiet moments between the miles, I had found answers I hadn't even known I was looking for. When I finally stood up and made my way back to the car, I felt a sense of calm, of purpose. The journey wasn't over yet, but I was ready for whatever came next. I had found something on this road, not a destination, but a way of seeing the world, of being present in each moment. And as I drove away from the cabin, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, I knew that wherever the road took me, I would be ready. The golden light of the late afternoon began to soften the edges of the world as I left the cabin behind. The road unwound before me once again, its familiar rhythm calming yet brimming with an undeniable sense of finality. This stretch of the journey felt different, quieter, perhaps, but also more vivid, like I was seeing it all with new eyes. It was as if everything that had come before had been leading me here, to this final stretch, where the road and I would reach some unspoken understanding. The landscape began to shift again. The thick forests gave way to wide, open fields bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. The sky above stretched in a perfect arc of blue, slowly deepening into the shades of evening, with the first hint of stars peeking through. It was the kind of scene you could only ever experience on a long drive, the kind where nature seems to unfold itself just for you, in its own time. As I drove, the thoughts that had lingered in my mind throughout the trip finally began to settle. The places I had passed, the strangers I had met, even the small moments of silence along the way, they all began to weave together, forming a narrative that felt bigger than the journey itself. It wasn't just a trip from St. George to Sherbrooke. It was the spaces between those 2 points that had become the real story, the quiet moments that had allowed me to reflect on things I had left behind and those still waiting to be discovered. I found myself thinking about the start of it all. When I had first left St. George, there had been an urgency in me, a need to escape something, though I hadn't been able to put it into words at the time. Now, nearing the end of this journey, that feeling had all but faded. What had seemed like a restless drive had turned into something else, a chance to understand that life wasn't about rushing toward destinations. It was about being on the road, letting it unfold without trying to control it. Up ahead, I saw the faint outline of Sherbrooke emerging on the horizon. The city was still a ways off, but its lights flickered faintly in the distance, a reminder that my original destination was within reach. There was no rush now, though. I slowed the car, taking in the last few miles with a sense of appreciation, knowing that once I arrived, everything would feel different, not because the city had changed, but because I had. The closer I got to Sherbrooke, the more I realized how far I had come, not just in distance, but in perspective. The city, which had once seemed like a goal to reach, now felt like another stop, just another point on the map of this journey that was still unfolding. There was no longer an expectation or pressure to arrive, just a quiet acceptance that I was exactly where I needed to be, both in the literal and the figurative sense. The road began to descend into the valley, bringing me closer to Sherbrooke. The buildings came into focus now, their lights growing brighter against the backdrop of the deepening sky. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a soft twilight, the sky turning indigo with streaks of orange still hanging on the edges. The city seemed to shimmer in the half-light, a peaceful glow that contrasted with the bustling energy I knew lay within. As I crossed over the final hill, the city of Sherbrooke stretched out before me in full view. It was familiar, but it felt different now. I could see the streets winding through the town, the river that split the city in two, the buildings that rose and fell with the landscape. But rather than feeling like the end of a journey, it felt like the beginning of something new. I pulled over to the side of the road for one last pause, looking out over the city and the winding river that flowed through its center. The air was cool now, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves, the kind that signals the change of seasons. I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet of the moment settle around me like an old friend. This, too, was part of the journey, these pauses, these moments of reflection, where the road stops for just a little while, giving you the space to take it all in. I thought back to the beginning, to the moment I had set out from St. George, unsure of what I was looking for. And now, standing on the edge of Sherbrooke, I realized it wasn't about finding anything at all. It was about the journey itself, the roads that led me here and the miles that had unfolded beneath my tires. It was about the quiet moments at the lake, the unexpected conversations with strangers, the empty highways that seemed to stretch on forever. It was about being open to whatever came next, without rushing toward it or holding on to it too tightly. The road had taught me that much, at least. As the lights of Sherbrooke began to flicker on one by one, I knew it was time to head into the city, to see what awaited me there. But I also knew that, in a way, the journey wasn't really over. The road always continued, whether you were driving on it or not. There would always be more places to go, more spaces to pass through, more roads to explore. And that was the beauty of it, that the journey never truly ended, because there was always something new waiting just beyond the horizon. I got back into the car, turned the engine on, and pulled back onto the road. The city was just ahead now, welcoming me in its quiet, glowing way. But as I drove the last few miles into Sherbrooke, I smiled to myself, knowing that the road, my road, stretched far beyond it.